Hi, I'm Joseph Ike, and you are with me today on Literati, the show that looks at what's going on in the literary space here in Africa and beyond. We interview people who are involved in the literary space. The show is brought to you on News Central by Glow. With me today in the studio is Professor Hakim Adi, from what I've just come to find out, the first Nigerian Professor of History at the University of Chichester. He's written a book we're going to be talking a lot about, Pan-Africanism, but he's an author of several other books. He is also working with young people. We'll hear a lot more about his experience. And he's from Ekiti State, just nearby next door here. So, Professor, you're welcome on the show today.
It's good to be here. Very good to be here.
You're in Lagos.
Mm-hmm.
Have you ridden a bike yet, an Okada?
I haven't. I'm not sure that I would even venture into Okada. I'm not
You've
sure.
never
about
ridden
that.
an Okada anyway?
I haven't. I have ridden a motorbike though.
No, they're different. Motorbike is different from Okada.
I know, but
Okay.
I have ridden a motorbike, but that was 1975.
Okay.
The roads were slightly safer in 1975, so I'd
All right.
probably stay in a car for now.
Now, this book, Pan-Africanism, is a very important piece, and reading through it, it was almost like the experience of reading through the book it wasn't as difficult as one would expect a textbook to be, an academic
good to hear.
piece. It was almost like you were going through a story to understand the real context of something that we often talk about. And I think that's a very important task to achieve, and you do it so well in this book.
Thank you very much.
And so, obviously, we have to begin the discussion around what is Pan-Africanism?
Okay. Pan-Africanism really is the idea that Africa is one, Africans are one, whether in the continent or in the diaspora, with a common history, a common future, and if you like, there is also a common struggle of Africans. And to achieve success in that struggle, there's a need for the unity of Africans, the unity of the African continent. And Pan-Africanism is really about trying to find solutions to those problems that face Africans at any one period of time. So in the 20th century, Pan-Africanism will be different from Pan-Africanism of the 19th century or the 18th century. And even within the 20th century, there will be different Pan-African approaches. But it's that concern for unity and liberation and the idea of the oneness of the struggles of Africa and the diaspora, you could say in short.
So you mentioned that what it means in practice, what it means practically, is going to be different depending on what time, where, and what we're talking about. But let's go back to where, if we had to situate an origin of this idea, where would you place that?
Well, in the book, I situated in the situation of the diaspora, that's to say the modern diaspora, which was largely a result of the kidnapping of Africans, the human trafficking of Africans from the 15th century onwards. And there are many different examples of those Africans in that new diaspora, which was created by enslavement and so on, coming together and acting together to try and solve the problems that they faced in common, which were the problems of enslavement, the problems of being in a different space. And because I have a habit of kind of situating things in Britain, but there are other examples, but I took a British example, which also involves a famous Nigerian, even though Nigeria didn't exist in the 18th century. So I situated with Alaudo Equiano and the organization he was involved in, the Sons of Africa, which was an organization of Africans from different parts of the continent who found themselves in Britain, who had been enslaved, who generally had managed to free themselves, and they came together to act as one, to speak with one voice, in their interest and to deal with a particular problem that faced them, which was the problem of enslavement, of human trafficking, and so on. So that's one example. As I say, there are other examples we could find in Brazil or in Spain or in the US and so on, of those who found themselves in that situation coming together, and one way in which they came together was to call themselves Africans. You know, we are the sons of Africa. So this is a new conception. They're not thinking of themselves as Yoruba or Igbo or whatever it may happen to be, but they are the sons of Africa or Africans, and acting together in that way. So the reason for having that start is to try and make that point, and to locate some of these efforts, like the Sons of Africa, or maybe an African churches movement in the US or the Caribbean, or the fraternities which existed in many Spanish-speaking or Portuguese-speaking countries, including Brazil, of Africans coming together to look after themselves, to look after their interests during the periods of enslavement in particular.
So how did that change over time?
It changed in many ways, again, depending on the circumstances. Sometimes it took a kind of religious orientation. People developed African churches or an African church movement, like the African Methodist Episcopal churches in the US. Later, the so-called Ethiopian church movement in South Africa, and also here in West Africa. Sometimes it took the form of repatriation, of people returning to the continent, from the US, from Britain, from Cuba, from Brazil, and or people who were liberated in various ways, returning to Sierra Leone and then coming back to Nigeria or coming back to the Gold Coast or wherever it was. So there are these various attempts at repatriation, or people coming from the US to Liberia and so on. Also there's what in the 19th century people often referred to as vindication or vindicationalism. In other words, the struggle against Eurocentrism, the struggle against racism, the struggle against the idea that Africa had no history, that Africans were inferior to Europeans. So we find many people contesting this view. Even Equiano, if you read his autobiography, he starts off by talking about Africa, his society, how civilized it is, how clean it is, how organized it is, how law-abiding it is, how everything which people think Africa isn't, he presents a different picture. So that continues through the 19th century, of people refuting all aspects of Eurocentrism. Even some people are arguing that God is an African, or God is a black man. People talking about particular African personality or Negro personality. In other words, that Europeans may have this personality, but we have something which is equally good or better. So there are all of these efforts.
We'll take a quick break and come back and take up on that contentious topic, the centering the modern day Pan-Africanism movement.
These days, there's a lot of information around, but there's also fake news and half-truths. On The Proof, we put these stories to the test to separate fact from fiction. Join us every Friday, 8:20 p.m. West African time on The Proof, showing on New Central TV.
Welcome back. If you're just joining us, I'm Joseph Ike, and we're on Literati, and we're having a very interesting conversation with Professor Hakim Adi about Pan-Africanism. Just before the break, we were talking about the modern Pan-Africanism, so to speak. So tell us a little bit more about that.
Towards the end of the 19th century, we find that, of course, Britain was the world's leading imperial power, was establishing colonies and invading the continent, had already established its colonies in the Caribbean and elsewhere. So as a result of that, those who were colonized tended to gravitate towards London, Britain, the center of the empire, not least because colonialism didn't provide any higher education, so people wanted to become professionals, they had to study somewhere else. So we had a kind of critical mass, not a big number of people, but a critical mass of people in Britain. And some of those in the 1890s formed the African Association. When it was the African Association which eventually convened the first Pan-African Conference, which was held in London in 1900. So that was really the first time the word was used as a way of self-defining. I know that the phrase Pan-African had been used in the US in a way, but it was first kind of coined and adopted really in London at that time. So that coming together of various intellectuals from the US, from Britain, from Africa, from the Caribbean, they came together with the idea of speaking as Africans with one voice to address all the problems which confronted Africans globally at that time. Of course, chiefly the division of Africa, colonial rule in Africa, colonial rule in the Caribbean, racism generally, anti-African racism, perhaps particularly in the US, problems of lynching and racist violence and so on. So it was a very important conference. It's usually credited to Henry Sylvester Williams, Trinidadian lawyer, but in fact the person who inspired him was Alice Kinloch, who was a South African woman who happened to be in Britain at that time. She was in fact touring Britain speaking about the problems confronting her compatriots. She inspired Henry Sylvester Williams. They jointly formed the African Association. So she, this African woman, is really the founding mother of the modern Pan-African movement.
And I think that's a very intriguing detail that needs to be brought out a lot more, because it almost seems like when we take a cursory look at the development of Pan-Africanism, there seems to be not that many women highlighted, the role of women, whereas we know that in actual fact, women did play a significant role across every spectrum of the movement, so to speak.
Indeed. I mean, certainly in the modern movement, I would say also probably even in the period of the forerunners, but certainly in the modern movement, women are not always highlighted or didn't necessarily always play the most prominent roles, or sometimes been forgotten or written out of history. But certainly as the movement went forward, women played a key role in the congresses in the 1920s. The conferences which W.B. Du Bois organized, for example, the 1927 Congress in New York was almost entirely organized by women, financed by women, and so on. The kind of Pan-African movements which developed, the Universal Negro Improvement Association of Marcus Garvey, some people say was jointly founded between Marcus Garvey and who became his first wife, Amy Ashwood Garvey. Certainly she played a very prominent role, and women played very prominent roles in that organization. And nowadays there's much more recognition of that. So I think throughout, women have played a very important role. Sometimes, as I say, in the background. The 5th Pan-African Congress held in Manchester, again, is largely credited to George Padmore, Kwame Nkrumah, and others. But if one looks at the organization of it and so on, again, women, and not always African women, also played a very significant role. So yeah, it's important to, anyway, to try and present history as it is, and not in a narrow way which excludes, some people, and particularly half the population or more than half the population.
Which you touch on another very important group in the Pan-African struggle, the Pan-African concept, which is the diaspora. How do we situate the diaspora within the Pan-African context? How would you do that?
Well, we have to look at what is our conception of the diaspora. obviously we know the meaning of the word, that we're talking about the, we can say the spread of Africans globally and so on. But I think sometimes we kind of place them in opposition to each other. In the history of Pan-Africanism, it's often the case that maybe those who were outside of the continent had, if you like, became more African or more aware of their Africanness,
yes.
As I explained with the Sons of Africa and others. And so therefore they were particularly instrumental in developing various forms of Pan-Africanism. But it's also the case that we sometimes make a kind of artificial division, that there's a continent and there's the diaspora. So if 10 Nigerians go to London, they kind of stop being Africans and they somehow become diasporic, and it's a strange division. And I, for example, give the example of an organisation like the West African Students' Union, which is formed in London in 1925. So do we consider that part of African history? Or is it only part of African history when they form a branch, or they form branches in West Africa? And those West African branches lead to the development of the Nigerian youth movement or the Gold Coast Youth Conference or so. So it's a slightly artificial division. Or if there are 500,000 Africans who are kidnapped and taken to a French colony in the Caribbean and they rise up in revolution, they all speak African languages, they're all born in Africa, is that part of African history, or does it become part of Caribbean history? So obviously there is a geographical difference, but I think sometimes drawing a kind of line that divides the two is not really how history presents itself. And so rather it's better to look at how history presents itself, and Pan-Africanism often allows us to do that. But in terms of understanding history and how it develops, I think that sometimes making this division between Africa and the diaspora is not helpful, and it's sometimes, if you look at my title, it's Professor of the History of Africa and the African Diaspora, because I do both. And I wouldn't want, my work on Africans in Britain, for example, just to be thought of as British history, although clearly it is British history. But to me, it's also African history, and the West African Students' Union is a very good example of an organisation, as I've said, so that operated in both geographical places. So I think to look at history as it is and as it evolves and develops is what's important.
All right. We'll come back to that thought in a minute. We'll take a short break and we'll be right back.
Africa is rising. Again, we hear our sounds echo on the other side. Afrobeat and Afropop reinvented, hip life brought back to life, new energy infused into Kwaito and Kwela. Africa is balling. Every stroke, every shot, every raise, we find our place at the top. Taking the helm of real power, new hopes for democracies. A breed of entrepreneurial tigers, audacious storytellers, and a promising generation raring to go. Truly, Africa is rising. And this is where the stories that define our continent live.
And we're back. If you're just joining us, this is Literati, the show that looks at what's going on in the literary space. We've been talking with Professor Adi on Pan-Africanism. Let's talk about your work with young historians. Tell us a little bit about that and how that plays out into not necessarily changing the narrative, but I like the way you put it earlier, the evolution of the narrative.
In Britain, we found, in fact, there was a the thing which alerted me in particular was a headline in a paper which said only 3 black students this year have trained to be history teachers. So that prompted me to look into some of the statistics and so on, and then get a group of people together. What we found was that amongst young people at university, history was the 3rd most unpopular subject.
What was the first?
Only veterinary science and agriculture were more unpopular in the sense of people applying to do those courses. If we looked at every level of education from secondary school to university, we found that young people of African or Caribbean heritage continue to drop out of history. So those who do well at the exams at 16, they don't go on and do exams at 18. Even those who do well at 18 don't go on and do degrees. Even those who do degrees don't go on and do postgraduate studies. So we find there are very few teachers at secondary school. There are very few academic historians. At that time, I was the only professor of African heritage in history in Britain. So we held a conference. We got everybody together. We worked with various other associations, and we said to people, okay, this is a situation. Nobody else is doing anything about it. So therefore, we should do something about it. So what should we do? So various suggestions came up. One of those was that, okay, we need some organization to encourage young people, okay? So we said, okay, well, you guys have decided that, so now we're going to form that association. Where is everybody disappeared? And okay, so anyway, we carried on. We formed the Young Historians Project, which is a project for young black people between the ages of 16 and 25. Who work on particular projects, and the project this is the 2nd project. We get some, we can call it official or semi-official funding. They've decided that for this project they wanted to focus on African women, the history of African women in Britain, from 1930 to 2000, connected with the health service, because so many African women are nurses or in other ways connected with the health service. So they thought that would be a good way of looking at this history of African women. They chose that topic because if you Google, African women in Britain, you won't find anything. Now, people may not know that. People understand that there's a black community or communities in Britain made up of African and Caribbean. At present, the African part of that is the biggest, the largest. But very often in Britain, what is presented as what people call Black British history completely excludes Africans from the continental Africans. It tends to be a kind of Caribbean-focused history. So they thought that this particular aspect was important and that they should follow it up. And so they've been searching for people, interviewing people who are nurses, doctors, phlebotomists, radiographers.
The whole spectrum.
Whole spectrum, anything to do with health. We think that the first woman actually to be a nurse during what we call the National Health Service, which began in 1948 in Britain, was also probably a Nigerian. So we're looking at all that kind of information to just to present it, because again, these women have been written out of history, and certainly as presented in Britain, and just to give them their rightful place. So the young historians are going to make a film. They are going to produce an online exhibition. They're going to paint a mural at Charing Cross Hospital in London and perhaps other hospitals, depicting some of these women. They're going to produce an e-book of the interviews so that people can use it in education and so on. And we also do work in schools, so they take what they find and then they find ways of presenting it in schools to encourage other young people. So the aim is always to engage with young people, to encourage them that history is about them, is about their families, is about their grandparents. It's not just about kings and queens or the white men of property.
Yeah.
It's about everybody, and they should be concerned and engage with it and study it and research it and produce it and write about it and film it and paint it
And live it.
and live it
Yeah.
and be it and make
be
it.
Yes, yes.
Most importantly,
And-
yes.
and make it.
You make history, and you
Yeah.
understand that, yes, you are the makers of history.
Yeah.
You are the agents of change, which is important in every country, not
Yes.
least Nigeria. That
and
we are
on the continent. And there's, in closing, there is a quote in this book that every time I pick up the book, it's the first image that comes to my mind. Africa reaching out to God, or reaching up to God. Now it's funny, everyone's familiar with the Bible, but I had to quickly go back to that reference and find that place. And it's interesting because in the book, it shows how different interpretations of that particular space, that particular line, have led to remarkably different interventions. I mean, for some people it meant, yeah, so we need to go teach them about God. And for some people it meant, so we need to do this and do that. What does that, have you ever actually read that place in the Bible, and what does it mean to you?
I think I have read it, but I'm not sure whether I can be an interpreter of biblical text.
Oh, well,
I think
I'm sure the biblical scholars will
I think-
excuse you on this one. What does it speak to
well,
you
let
personally?
me give one. Rather than saying what I think, let me give one example.
Okay.
And I can't. So one example, of course, is Emperor Menelik. So Menelik is supposed to have said, Africa has a need of no one.
Yes.
It stretches out its hand only to God. In other words, he presented it as an act of self-reliance, that we as Africans we're self-reliant. And of course this was during the period when Ethiopians were fighting against Italian invasion.
Which they won that
Which
one.
they won at the famous Battle of Adwa in 1896. So I think, and of course that victory was a great inspiration to Africans all over the world. And the fact that there was not only an independent African country, but an independent African country which had defended its sovereignty by military means and defeated a European rival, or European invader, not rival. So anyway, I think that's the idea of self-reliance is how I'm going to present things.
Because I was going to keep pushing until you gave us what your own idea, but the idea of self-reliance, and I think that's a fair point. So we'll leave it at that for now. The book is titled Pan-Africanism. There's so much to learn from this book, and I'm really grateful that you were able. Is this the one that took 10 years to write?
No, this was a bit shorter. This I think was about 3 years, maybe something like that.
And I agree this is a book that everybody should read, not just Africans. So
Very
go out
kind
and
of you.
get yourself a copy, and it's actually a very, very, very pleasurable read.
Very
Thank you
kind.
so much, Professor Adi, for
Thank you
being
for
with us,
having me.
and all the best with your work with the young historians. We can't wait to see what comes out of that.
We'll let you know, definitely.
Thank you so much. Until next time, I'm Joseph Ike. This is Literati. You can join the conversation with #NCLiterati, and see you soon. Thank you.